1. September 1986, Herald Square, New York City. The massive brass doors of Gimbels, the very store that invented the modern Thanksgiving Day parade, were locked for the final time. Inside the million-square-foot flagship, the once glowing cosmetic counters sat in total darkness. The legendary bargain basements were stripped to the bare concrete. Thousands of employees, many who had spent their entire adult lives walking these floors, wept as the iconic liquidation banners were finally pulled down. At its peak, Gimbels was an undisputed titan of American retail. It boasted 36 massive department stores, generated over $1 billion in sales, and was so culturally dominant that "Does Macy's tell Gimbels?" became a national catchphrase. It was the store that introduced the slinky, anchored the middle class, and defined the magic of holiday window shopping for generations of families. But decades later, the empire was utterly erased. Not just closed, but entirely dismantled, sold off in pieces until the Gimbels name evaporated from the American landscape. How does a retail giant that literally shaped modern consumer culture vanish so completely? The collapse of Gimbels wasn't a sudden, dramatic bankruptcy, nor was it simply a casualty of losing a war against Macy's. The truth is far more tragic. This is the story of Gimbel Brothers, a cautionary tale of what happens when a pioneering family's passion is swallowed by corporate spreadsheets, when a brand gets trapped in the muddy middle of the retail market, and when an empire realizes too late that survival requires more than just a famous name. 2. Long before the glittering display windows of Herald Square, before the million-square-foot palaces of consumption, the Gimbel retail empire existed entirely within a single leather pack. The year was 1835. Adam Gimbel, an 18-year-old Jewish immigrant fleeing political instability and poverty in Bavaria, arrived at the bustling docks of New Orleans. He spoke little English, possessed virtually no money, and had no formal connections in the New World. Like thousands of immigrants before him, he began his American life with raw labor, finding work on the teeming docks of the Mississippi River. But Adam did not intend to remain a dock worker. Saving every possible penny, he soon purchased a meager inventory of notions: needles, thread, pocket knives, cheap fabric, and simple tools. Loading these goods onto his back, he became a peddler. For 7 years, Adam Gimbel walked the muddy, often treacherous trails of the Mississippi River Valley. He trudged from isolated farm to isolated farm, carrying his store on his shoulders. This punishing existence was more than just a way to survive. It was an unparalleled education in frontier economics. Adam learned exactly what pioneer families desperately needed, what they desired but couldn't afford, and crucially, how much they were willing to trade for it. By 1842, his aching shoulders and worn boots had earned him enough capital to stop walking. He settled in the frontier town of Vincennes, Indiana, a rough and tumble trading post situated strategically on the Wabash River. There, Adam opened a small, unassuming dry goods store. It was called simply A. Gimbel. In the 1840s, frontier retail was a chaotic, often predatory affair. The prevailing business model was caveat emptor: let the buyer beware. Prices were rarely displayed. A merchant would assess a customer's appearance, guess their wealth, and quote an inflated price. A fierce, exhausting haggling session would follow. If a customer discovered later that the goods were defective or they had been overcharged, the merchant's response was typically a shrug. The transaction was final. Adam Gimbel decided to abandon this universally accepted system. He introduced a radical, almost unthinkable concept to the rugged Indiana territory: fixed prices and guaranteed satisfaction. He placed clear price tags on every item in his store. Whether you were the town doctor or an illiterate farmhand, the price of a yard of calico was exactly the same. Even more revolutionary, he instituted a return policy. If a customer bought a shovel and the handle broke the next day, Adam Gimbel would exchange it or refund the money, no questions asked. To his competitors, this was financial suicide. How could a merchant survive if he couldn't maximize profits on every single transaction through aggressive haggling? How could he absorb the cost of returned goods? The answer lay in volume and trust. Adam recognized that the frontier was hungry for reliability. The grueling process of haggling bred resentment and suspicion. By offering fair, non-negotiable prices and standing behind his merchandise, Gimbel wasn't just selling dry goods, he was selling peace of mind. The strategy worked brilliantly. Trust generated intense loyalty. A farmer who knew he wouldn't be cheated at A. Gimbel would travel extra miles, bypassing other stores, to spend his money there. The tiny store in Vincennes prospered, expanding its inventory from basic necessities to include manufactured goods brought in from the East Coast via riverboats. As Adam's 7 sons grew, they were brought into the business, learning the doctrine of fair pricing and customer service that their father had pioneered on the muddy banks of the Mississippi. By the late 1880s, the frontier was closing. The United States was rapidly industrializing and urbanizing. Adam Gimbel, now an aging patriarch, realized that the future of retail did not lie in small river towns, but in the booming industrial cities. The family needed a larger stage. In 1887, under the leadership of Adam's son, Isaac Gimbel, the family made a momentous move. They pooled their capital and opened a massive new store in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a thriving hub of manufacturing and European immigration. They named it Gimbel Brothers. This was no longer a frontier dry goods shop. It was a multi-story emporium designed to cater to the rising urban middle class. The peddler's pack had evolved into a brick-and-mortar fortress. The Milwaukee store was an immediate sensation, proving that Adam Gimbel's core philosophy, fair prices and guaranteed satisfaction, could scale to an industrial level. The success in Wisconsin provided the Gimbels with the confidence and the capital they needed for their next, far more audacious leap. The family began looking eastward, toward the true centers of American wealth and power. The age of the department store was dawning, and the Gimbel brothers were determined to build the biggest empire of them all. 3. By the 1890s, the aging Adam Gimbel handed the reins of his growing business to his ambitious sons, most notably Isaac, Ellis, and Charles. While their father had conquered the frontier and the industrial Midwest, the second generation of Gimbels set their sights on a much grander prize: the thriving, fiercely competitive retail markets of the East Coast. They recognized that the American consumer landscape was shifting. The upper and middle classes no longer just wanted to buy goods. They wanted to be entertained, pampered, and dazzled. The brothers made their first major eastward strike in 1894, opening a massive, multi-story department store in Philadelphia. This was not merely a larger version of their Milwaukee outpost. It was a fundamental reimagining of what a store could be. The Philadelphia Gimbels was designed as a palace of consumption. It was built to awe. In this era, shopping was rapidly transforming from a domestic chore into a glamorous leisure activity, particularly for women who were entering the public sphere in unprecedented numbers. The Gimbel brothers leaned into this cultural shift heavily. Their Philadelphia store featured gleaming mahogany counters, opulent lighting, and an army of impeccably dressed sales clerks trained in the family's signature brand of unwavering courtesy. They introduced sprawling tea rooms where women could socialize, reading rooms for gentlemen, and even in-store post offices. They didn't just want customers to visit. They wanted them to spend their entire day within the walls of Gimbels. It was in Philadelphia that the Gimbels executed one of the most brilliant marketing maneuvers in American retail history. In 1920, Ellis Gimbel wanted a way to draw massive crowds to the toy department for the crucial holiday shopping season. He organized a grand procession featuring 50 people, 15 cars, and a fireman dressed as Santa Claus marching down Market Street, concluding right at the doors of the Gimbel store. It was the first modern Thanksgiving Day parade in American history. The event was a spectacular success, permanently intertwining the Gimbel name with the magic of the holiday season. A full 4 years before their rival Macy's would launch a similar, more famous parade in New York. But the ultimate test of the Gimbel brothers' ambition remained. To truly conquer American retail, they had to conquer Manhattan. In 1910, Isaac Gimbel orchestrated the most audacious and financially perilous gamble the family had ever taken. He secured a plot of land at Herald Square in New York City, directly intersecting with the city's brand new subway lines. The location was strategic brilliance, but the execution required staggering capital. They commissioned the legendary architect Daniel Burnham, famous for the Flatiron Building and the Chicago World's Fair, to design a colossal, million-square-foot flagship store. The financial risk was astronomical. Building a retail fortress of that scale in the heart of the world's most competitive market pushed the family's resources to the absolute limit. It was an all-or-nothing wager. If the New York store failed to attract the teeming masses of Manhattan, the debt would swallow the entire Gimbel empire, dragging down the profitable Philadelphia and Milwaukee stores with it. Furthermore, they were building this behemoth just 1 block away from the undisputed king of New York retail, Macy's. The tension leading up to the grand opening in the fall of 1910 was palpable. The Gimbel family had essentially placed a multi-million-dollar bet that they could beat the reigning champion on their own turf. When the brass doors of the New York flagship finally swung open, the city held its breath. The sheer scale of the building was staggering. It boasted 27 acres of selling space, a ventilation system that completely changed the air in the building every few minutes, and a massive bank of elevators and escalators to move tens of thousands of shoppers across its vast floors. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The New York public, always hungry for novelty and spectacle, flooded the aisles. Gimbels immediately captured the imagination and the wallets of the city's rapidly expanding middle class. By offering a slightly more accessible, bargain-conscious alternative to the haughty upscale boutiques, while maintaining an aura of grandeur that smaller dry goods stores lacked, Gimbels found its perfect demographic. By the end of the 1920s, the Gimbel brothers had achieved the impossible. The descendants of a penniless Bavarian peddler now commanded a retail empire that generated tens of millions of dollars annually. They operated sprawling flagships in major metropolitan hubs, employed tens of thousands of workers, and had firmly embedded their family name into the cultural bedrock of the United States. They had built the empire, but as the Roaring Twenties gave way to a new, more volatile era, the challenge would shift from building the fortress to defending it. The Great War for Herald Square was just beginning. 4. By the 1930s, the Gimbel empire was no longer just a collection of successful stores. It was a bona fide American institution. The transition from the Roaring Twenties into the Great Depression destroyed thousands of businesses, but Gimbels possessed the sheer scale and the strategic acumen to weather the economic storm. Under the leadership of Bernard Gimbel, the grandson of the original peddler Adam Gimbel, the company embarked on an aggressive campaign of expansion and diversification that would define its golden age. Bernard was a visionary who understood that the retail landscape was stratifying. While the massive flagship Gimbel stores brilliantly served the vast, bargain-conscious middle class, there was immense untapped wealth in the luxury sector. In a masterstroke of corporate strategy, Gimbel brothers had previously acquired Saks & Company, taking full control of the burgeoning high-end retailer. They poured capital into building the magnificent Saks Fifth Avenue flagship, creating an unparalleled destination for the elite. This dual-pronged approach, Gimbels for the masses, Saks for the upper crust, ultimately transformed Gimbel Brothers into the largest department store corporation in the world. But it was the flagship store at Herald Square that remained the beating, populist heart of the empire, and it was there that the most legendary rivalry in American retail history played out. Just one block north of Gimbels stood Macy's, the undisputed colossus of New York retail. The proximity of these two titans, sharing the same subway stops, the same street traffic, and the same demographic, created a crucible of competition so intense it became a cultural phenomenon. It was a war fought on multiple fronts: newspaper advertising, elaborate holiday window displays, exclusive merchandising, and above all, pricing. The primary battleground was the relentless daily price war. Both stores operated under a strict pledge that they would not be undersold by any competitor in the city. If Macy's advertised a set of fine dining china for $10, Gimbels would slash their price to $9.90 the very next morning. Macy's would then deploy a small army of comparison shoppers, undercover employees who roamed the expansive aisles of Gimbels with hidden notepads to check price tags and report back to their managers. Gimbels, in turn, employed its own sophisticated network of spies to infiltrate Macy's. This high-stakes game of corporate espionage became the stuff of urban legend. The rivalry was so deeply ingrained in the national consciousness that it spawned a catchphrase that echoed across the country from boardrooms to living rooms. Does Macy's tell Gimbels? The rhetorical question, used universally to deflect inquiries about proprietary secrets or confidential plans, perfectly encapsulated the fierce, secretive nature of their daily combat. It was a profound testament to how deeply these two department stores had woven themselves into the fabric of everyday American vernacular. During this golden age, walking into the Herald Square Gimbels was an event. The air smelled of an intoxicating mix of roasted nuts from the candy counters, expensive perfume from the cosmetics bays, and polished leather from the shoe departments. The brass-doored elevators, operated by white-gloved attendants, functioned as vertical carriages, transporting wide-eyed shoppers through a multi-level wonderland of consumer goods. To be a Gimbels customer in this era was to participate in a uniquely American ritual, a shared cultural experience that transcended mere commerce. 5. The rivalry with Macy's wasn't solely fought over pennies and newspaper ad space. It was a relentless battle for exclusive, world-stopping merchandise. Gimbels understood that to win the retail war, they had to be the place where the future of consumer goods was unveiled. Perhaps the most famous example of this occurred in November 1945 at the Gimbels store in Philadelphia. A mechanical engineer named Richard James had invented a simple, croissants aromatic coiled spring toy, but he was struggling to convince traditional toy shops to carry it. The management at Gimbels, always hungry for a spectacle, agreed to give him a small display space. James set up an inclined board and simply let his invention walk down the slope. Within 90 minutes, all 400 units he had brought were sold at $1 apiece. The Slinky was born. This moment was not just a triumph for a lone inventor. It was a testament to the unmatched foot traffic and the sheer gravitational pull of the Gimbels empire. If a product debuted at Gimbels, America paid attention. Beneath the glamorous main floors, another revolution was cementing the company's financial dominance: the legendary Gimbels Bargain Basement. While their sister company, Saks Fifth Avenue, catered exclusively to the elite, and the upper floors of Gimbels served the solid middle class, the basement was designed for the budget-conscious, aspiring shopper. But it was far more than a dusty clearance rack. The basement was a chaotic, thrilling treasure hunt. Women would notoriously throw elbows to grab discounted fashion knockoffs, overstocked linens, or slightly irregular homewares. It operated on high volume and razor-thin margins, brilliantly turning excess inventory into pure cash flow while capturing every possible demographic of the urban shopper. This multi-tiered strategy, offering everything from high society fashion to basement bargains under one corporate umbrella, made Gimbels a truly democratic space. By 1947, the brand's cultural dominance was so absolute that it was immortalized on the silver screen in the beloved holiday classic, Miracle on 34th Street. While Macy's was the primary setting of the film, the entire plot hinged on the intense, very real rivalry between the two retail titans. When the Macy's Santa Claus began directing parents to go to Gimbels to find toys that Macy's had run out of, it was a joke that every American from coast to coast instantly understood. The rivalry had transcended business. It was American folklore. As the 1950s dawned, Gimbel brothers appeared entirely invincible. They had survived the depths of the Great Depression, thrived through the rationing of World War II, and were now riding the massive crest of the post-war economic boom. Corporate profits soared. The sprawling flagship stores in New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Milwaukee were humming machines of commerce, employing tens of thousands of workers. The Gimbel family name was literally carved into the limestone of America's greatest cities. But in the world of retail, the seeds of destruction are almost always planted during the harvest of greatest success. The executives, looking down from their mahogany-paneled offices in Herald Square, were entirely focused on their urban fortress and their endless war with Macy's. They were perfecting a model of downtown, centralized shopping that had worked for half a century. What they failed to notice was that the American dream was quietly packing its bags, starting its engines, and moving out of the city. A massive demographic earthquake was coming, and the mighty Gimbels flagship was standing right on the fault line. 6. As the 1950s bled into the 1960s, the American landscape was undergoing the most dramatic physical transformation in its history. The catalyst was the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, a massive infrastructure project that paved the way for a radical new way of living. Fueled by the GI Bill and a booming post-war economy, the American middle class, the very lifeblood of the Gimbels empire, was fleeing the crowded, noisy urban centers. They were packing up their station wagons and moving to the sprawling, newly built suburbs of Long Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and beyond. With this mass migration came a fundamental shift in how Americans shopped. The ritual of the downtown shopping trip, dressing up, taking the train into the city, navigating crowded sidewalks, and spending a full day browsing multi-level department stores, was suddenly losing its appeal. The modern suburbanite had a car, a driveway, and a desire for absolute convenience. They wanted to drive to a single location, park for free in a massive asphalt lot, and buy everything they needed without battling city traffic or paying transit fares. Enter the enclosed shopping mall. When the first indoor climate-controlled malls began opening across the country, they represented an existential threat to the traditional downtown flagship. Competitors like Sears and J.C. Penney recognized this tectonic shift immediately. They aggressively positioned themselves as the anchor tenants of these new suburban retail meccas. Even Macy's, Gimbels' eternal rival, began a calculated, well-funded expansion into the suburban rings surrounding New York and other major cities, adapting their model for the car-driving consumer. Gimbels, however, found itself suffering from a fatal case of strategic inertia. The executives in the Herald Square boardroom were so heavily invested, both financially and emotionally, in their colossal downtown fortresses that they were slow to comprehend the permanence of the suburban flight. Their entire business model, their complex supply chains, their localized advertising strategies, and their corporate identity were inextricably tethered to the dense foot traffic of the urban grid. It wasn't that Gimbels completely ignored the suburbs. They did build branch stores in developing shopping centers, pushing into places like Roosevelt Field on Long Island or expanding their footprint around Milwaukee and Philadelphia. But these efforts were often reactive rather than proactive. More importantly, the corporate culture treated these suburban branches as mere outposts, secondary satellites to the glorious downtown flagships. They failed to realize that, for the new generation of shoppers, the mall was not a secondary outpost. It was the absolute center of the retail universe. This hesitation created a devastating operational dilemma. A 1 million-square-foot building in the heart of Manhattan requires an astronomical amount of capital just to keep the lights on, the escalators running, and the vast sales floors staffed. In the 1920s and 1930s, the sheer, crushing volume of daily foot traffic easily absorbed these fixed costs. But as the 1960s progressed, the crowds in downtown districts began to visibly thin. The reliable middle-class shoppers were at the mall, leaving the massive downtown flagships to rely on a shrinking pool of urban residents and office workers popping in on their lunch breaks. As foot traffic steadily decreased, the immense overhead of the flagship stores began to violently compress the company's profit margins. Gimbels was caught in a trap of its own making. They couldn't simply close the Herald Square or downtown Philadelphia locations. Those historic buildings were the very soul of the brand, generating the massive gross revenue needed to sustain the overall corporate structure, even as their actual profitability plummeted. Yet, every dollar spent maintaining and modernizing these aging urban behemoths was a dollar not invested in dominating the new suburban frontier. Furthermore, the specific magic of the Gimbels experience proved incredibly difficult to export. The legendary bargain basement, with its chaotic energy, aggressive discounting, and treasure hunt atmosphere, felt entirely out of place in the sanitized, orderly, brightly lit environment of a new suburban mall. The brand was losing its distinct populist identity. In the city, Gimbels was an institution. In the suburbs, it was just another department store at the end of a long corridor, increasingly indistinguishable from the dozen other retailers surrounding it. By the end of the 1960s, the Gimbels empire was still generating hundreds of millions of dollars in sales on paper, but the foundation was rotting away. The fierce, agile company that had once revolutionized frontier trading and conquered Manhattan had grown bloated, slow, and overly reliant on a retail model that was rapidly becoming obsolete. The fortress walls of Herald Square hadn't been breached by a competitor. The army of customers had simply marched around them, heading toward the highway. The family that had built the empire was growing tired. The profit margins were dangerously thin, and the company was exposed. Gimbels desperately needed a lifeline, a massive influx of capital, and a visionary new direction. What they got instead was a corporate buyout that would slowly, methodically, seal their fate. 7. By the early 1970s, the Gimbel family had been at the helm of their retail empire for over 130 years. From Adam Gimbel's solitary treks along the muddy banks of the Mississippi River to the glittering million-square-foot palaces of Manhattan and Philadelphia, the business had always been driven by the singular vision and personal obsession of the family's patriarchs. But as the 1973 fiscal year approached, the current generation of leadership was visibly exhausted. The retail landscape was no longer a gentleman's game of downtown rivalries. It had become a ruthless, sprawling, suburban war of attrition. Gimbels was bleeding capital, attempting to maintain its colossal, aging downtown flagships, while simultaneously trying to fund the construction of new mall-based branch stores. The profit margins were compressing rapidly. The legendary price wars with Macy's, once a source of thrilling corporate pride, had simply become an unsustainable drain on resources. The family realized a harsh truth. To survive the coming decade, Gimbels needed a massive, unprecedented injection of outside capital. They needed a corporate savior. They found one in an unlikely place: the tobacco industry. During the 1970s, major tobacco conglomerates were facing the first massive waves of public health backlash and government regulation. Desperate to diversify their holdings away from cigarettes, these corporations began buying up vast portfolios of seemingly safe, cash-generating American businesses. Betis Inc., the American subsidiary of the colossal British American Tobacco Company, set its sights on the retail sector. In 1973, Betis approached the Gimbel family with an offer that was practically impossible to refuse. They proposed a complete buyout of Gimbel Brothers Inc. For the family, it offered an elegant, highly lucrative exit strategy from a business that was becoming overwhelmingly complex and capital-intensive. The papers were signed. The handshake was finalized. The descendants of Adam Gimbel surrendered control, and the legendary retailer officially ceased to be a family business. It was now merely a line item on the sprawling balance sheet of a multinational conglomerate. On the surface, the Betis acquisition looked like a tremendous victory for Gimbels. The stores would finally have access to the deep corporate pockets necessary to modernize their aging infrastructure and aggressively expand into the suburbs. The thousands of employees working the floors were told that this was a new dawn, a guarantee of long-term stability and growth. But hidden within the architecture of this monumental acquisition was a devastating reality. Betis had not spent their millions because they believed in the future of the middle-class Gimbels department stores. They bought Gimbel Brothers Inc. for one specific, highly calculated reason. The acquisition included full ownership of Saks Fifth Avenue. Saks was the crown jewel. It was highly profitable, largely immune to the demographic shifts hurting middle-tier retail, and carried an unparalleled aura of global luxury. Gimbels, with its chaotic bargain basements and heavy downtown overhead, was suddenly viewed by its new corporate masters not as a proud flagship, but as the burdensome baggage that came attached to Saks. Overnight, the corporate dynamic radically shifted. The brand that had literally invented the Thanksgiving Day parade was relegated to second-tier status within its own house, setting the stage for a slow, agonizing suffocation by spreadsheet. 8. The immediate aftermath of the 1973 Betis acquisition was not a dramatic, sudden collapse, but rather a slow, demoralizing shift in corporate culture. For over a century, Gimbel Brothers had been run by merchants, people who loved the daily theater of retail, who understood the chaotic energy of the bargain basement, and who felt immense personal pride in every holiday window display. Now the ultimate decisions regarding the company's future were being made by tobacco executives and financial analysts, sitting in boardrooms thousands of miles away in London and Louisville, Kentucky. To these new corporate overseers, the historical romance and retail magic that had built the Gimbels empire were irrelevant. They spoke exclusively the language of profit margins, quarterly earnings, and return on investment. And in that cold, mathematical light, the contrast between their two newly acquired retail properties was glaring. Saks Fifth Avenue was a high-margin cash machine, catering to a wealthy demographic that was largely insulated from economic downturns. Gimbels, conversely, was a low-margin, high-overhead operation battling for a shrinking middle-class dollar in aging downtown districts. The resulting corporate strategy was devastatingly clear. Betis heavily favored their luxurious crown jewel. Capital was aggressively funneled into Saks Fifth Avenue to fund sleek renovations, nationwide expansion, and high-end marketing campaigns. Gimbels, however, was immediately treated like a problematic stepchild. Requests from Gimbels executives for critical funding to modernize the massive, aging Herald Square flagship, or to aggressively pursue prime real estate in the new suburban malls, were repeatedly denied or severely scaled back by the parent company. The visible decline of the stores began to accelerate almost immediately. Deferred maintenance became the standard operating procedure. The once gleaming brass elevator doors in the New York store began to tarnish. The carpets in the Philadelphia flagship grew visibly threadbare. The lighting on the sales floors felt a little dimmer. The display cases a little dustier. to the fiercely loyal employees who had spent decades working these floors, the seasoned saleswomen who knew their regular customers by name, the window dressers who considered their seasonal work a public art form. The cultural shift was heartbreaking. They realized they were no longer working for a pioneering family that cared deeply about its civic legacy. They were working for a distant conglomerate that viewed them merely as a depreciating, troublesome asset. This lack of corporate investment created a lethal, self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the Gimbels stores increasingly looked tired and outdated, they attracted fewer affluent shoppers. Because they attracted fewer shoppers, gross revenue dropped. And because revenue dropped, Beta's financial officers felt entirely justified in cutting the operational budgets even further. They demanded that Gimbels management slash overhead to maintain basic profitability, leading to hiring freezes and mass layoffs of experienced sales staff. The legendary, attentive customer service that Adam Gimbel had pioneered on the frontier was quietly replaced by understaffed floors and frustrated shoppers wandering wide aisles looking for an open cash register. The billion-dollar handshake that was supposed to save the company had, in reality, locked it in a cage. Gimbels was slowly starving of capital, setting the stage for an identity crisis that would tear the brand apart. 9. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the American retail landscape polarized in a way that Gimbels was entirely unprepared to handle. The consumer market was rapidly splitting into two distinct extremes, leaving a vast, perilous chasm in the center. On one end of the spectrum, upscale retailers were transforming shopping into high-fashion theater. Competitors like Bloomingdale's were pioneering the concept of the department store as a glamorous, though a trend-setting destination. Concurrently, Gimbels' own sister company, Saks Fifth Avenue, was riding a wave of immense corporate investment from their parent company, BATUS, expanding their luxury footprint across the country and catering to an increasingly wealthy upper class. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a new breed of discount titans was rising. Kmart, Target, and a rapidly expanding Walmart were ruthlessly perfecting the art of high-volume, low-margin retail. They offered cavernous, brightly lit stores surrounded by massive suburban parking lots, stripping away all the expensive frills of the traditional department store to deliver absolute bottom-dollar prices. And then there was Gimbels. Historically, Gimbels had thrived as the ultimate middle-class destination. They were slightly cheaper than the luxury boutiques, but offered a significantly more dignified, full-service experience than a five and dime. But in this new, highly polarized era, the muddy middle was the most dangerous place a retailer could be. Gimbels suddenly found itself suffering from a catastrophic identity crisis. They were no longer glamorous enough to attract the affluent shopper, yet they carried far too much downtown overhead to effectively compete on price with the ruthless, sprawling efficiency of a Kmart. Why would a suburban mother drive into Philadelphia, pay for a parking garage, and navigate an aging, dimly lit multi-story building to buy a basic toaster, when she could buy the exact same toaster for less money in a brand new, single-level discount store just 2 miles from her house? Gimbels had no compelling answer to this question. They offered neither prestige nor maximum value. They simply existed on momentum and memory. This strategic paralysis was brutally exacerbated by the financial starvation imposed by Betas. The parent company's refusal to inject meaningful capital into the Gimbels brand meant the physical stores were trapped in a state of visible, embarrassing decay. The grand architectural statements of the 1910s and 1920s were now massive liabilities. Roofs leaked. Escalators frequently broke down and sat idle for weeks, awaiting corporate approval for repairs. The once luxurious fitting rooms looked tired and neglected. The massive display windows, which had once stopped traffic on Herald Square, now often featured uninspired, recycled mannequins and lackluster merchandising. To make matters worse, the massive, understaffed downtown buildings became prime targets for an epidemic of shoplifting, known in the industry as shrink. With corporate mandates relentlessly slashing payroll to preserve agonizingly thin profit margins, the expansive sales floors were left largely unguarded. Professional thieves and casual shoplifters alike quickly realized that the sprawling, multi-level layouts of the flagship stores, filled with blind spots and unmonitored exits, were exceptionally easy to exploit. To compensate for these massive inventory losses, store managers were forced to cut customer service even further, creating a vicious cycle of decline. The seasoned sales clerks, who remembered the roaring crowds of the post-war boom and the thrill of the Macy's rivalry, were now forced to apologize to customers for threadbare carpets and out-of-stock merchandise. Shoppers who still remained loyal to the Gimbels name were met with long, frustrating lines at the few remaining open registers, manned by exhausted, demoralized cashiers. The brand was caught in a death spiral, and the executives in London were rapidly losing patience. 10. By 1984, the situation within the Gimbel brothers' empire had deteriorated from a chronic, lingering illness into an acute, terminal crisis. The broader American economy was roaring through the 1980s, fueled by the rise of the yuppie, aggressive credit card spending, and a culture of conspicuous consumption. Malls were packed, and luxury retailers were experiencing record-breaking profits. Yet, inside the aging walls of Gimbels, the atmosphere was one of palpable, undeniable decay. The brand was bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. The tobacco conglomerate Betas, which had acquired Gimbels a decade earlier specifically to get their hands on Saks Fifth Avenue, was completely done pretending they cared about the historic department store. To the executives in London, the Gimbels division was no longer a disappointing stepchild. It was an actively dangerous financial hemorrhage. The 36 remaining Gimbels locations, concentrated primarily in New York, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, were collectively dragging down the parent company's quarterly earnings. In the ruthless corporate environment of the 1980s, an era defined by leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, and a relentless focus on shareholder value, there was zero room for sentimentality. The 140-year legacy of Adam Gimbel's frontier peddling, the creation of the Thanksgiving Day Parade, and the legendary Herald Square price wars meant absolutely nothing to the accountants reviewing the balance sheets. The spreadsheets dictated that Gimbels had to be neutralized. The terminal phase began when Battis management started making unusually candid, disparaging remarks about the Gimbels division to the financial press. They openly referred to the chain as a significant burden and a drag on their overall corporate performance. In the highly interdependent ecosystem of retail, this public declaration of no confidence was essentially a self-inflicted death warrant. The moment suppliers and manufacturers read these headlines, panic set in. In retail, inventory is purchased on credit, with the expectation that the store will sell the goods and pay the vendor back 30 to 90 days later. But if a parent company publicly admits a retailer is failing, vendors instantly lose faith that they will ever see their money. Almost overnight, major apparel brands, cosmetics companies, and home goods manufacturers began restricting their shipments to Gimbels. They demanded cash, on delivery, or simply refused to fulfill orders entirely. This created a catastrophic visual for the consumer. Shoppers who walked into a Gimbels branch in 1984 or 1985 were often greeted by wide, empty gaps on the sales floor. The cosmetic counters, traditionally the glowing, high-margin focal point of the main floor, looked ransacked and abandoned. The clothing racks were sparsely populated with outdated, unwanted inventory that the buyers had managed to secure at deep discounts. You cannot sell what you do not have, and Gimbels was rapidly running out of merchandise. In a desperate, chaotic attempt to reverse the freefall, the remaining Gimbels management team launched a series of frantic, poorly funded initiatives. They tried to artificially upscale the stores by bringing in higher-priced merchandise, hoping to capture some of the affluent traffic heading to Saks or Bloomingdale's. But slapping a designer price tag on a dress displayed in a dimly lit aging store with threadbare carpets fooled no one. The wealthy shoppers stayed away, and the sudden price hikes only served to alienate the last remaining budget-conscious loyalists who had stuck with the brand. It was the final, fatal miscalculation. 11. The holiday season of 1985 served as a grim, unofficial wake for the once mighty empire. Traditionally, Christmas at Gimbels was a period of frantic, joyous chaos. The Herald Square flagship was historically a temple of holiday commerce, the very institution that had gifted America its first Thanksgiving Day parade and anchored the cinematic magic of Miracle on 34th Street. But in December 1985, the magic was definitively dead. The famous display windows, once a dazzling showcase of mechanical elves and winter wonderlands, were now sparsely decorated and visibly uninspired, constructed on a shoestring budget. Inside the toy department, the legendary launch pad that had introduced the Slinky to the world, was a depressing landscape of half-empty shelves and discounted second-tier merchandise. Macy's, just one block north, was thronged with tens of thousands of eager shoppers, its cash registers ringing ceaselessly. Meanwhile, the cavernous floors of Gimbels echoed with the hollow sound of sparse footsteps on scuffed linoleum. The battle for Herald Square was over. In January 1986, the inevitable hammer finally fell. Baitis executives in London, having exhausted their patience and their willingness to absorb further financial losses, officially announced that the entire Gimbel Brothers division was up for sale. Their initial, optimistic hope was to find a single corporate buyer willing to take over the entire 36-store chain, preserving the brand name and the workforce. However, the retail industry looked at the Gimbels portfolio and collectively recoiled. The massive downtown flagship buildings in New York, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee, once the ultimate symbols of the company's power, were now viewed as ancient, unmanageable liabilities requiring hundreds of millions of dollars in deferred maintenance. Nobody wanted to buy a 140-year-old brand that was hemorrhaging cash and completely trapped in the muddy middle of the market. Realizing that a single corporate savior was not going to materialize, Baitis made a cold, calculated pivot. If they could not sell the living company, they would carve up the corpse. They announced a strategy of piecemeal liquidation. Baitis began quietly negotiating with regional competitors to sell off the real estate and the valuable suburban mall leases. Boscov's agreed to purchase several of the Pennsylvania locations. Allied Stores stepped in to absorb parts of the New York and New Jersey fleet, converting them into Stern's department stores. In the ultimate crushing indignity, even Macy's swooped in to purchase a handful of the suburban Gimbels locations, absorbing the remains of its fallen rival. For the approximately 13,000 employees still working across the remaining stores, the news was a devastating psychological blow. Many of them learned about the piecemeal dismantling of their company not from their managers, but by reading the morning newspapers. This wasn't just a job for the veteran staff, it was an identity. There were women working the cosmetic counters and men managing the shoe departments who had been with Gimbels for 30 or 40 years. They had survived economic recessions and shifting cultural trends, always believing in the fundamental resilience of the brand. Now, they realized their fierce loyalty had been entirely one-sided. They were being unceremoniously tossed aside by overseas executives who had likely never even walked through a Gimbels bargain basement. The announcement triggered a bizarre, agonizing limbo. The stores remained open to the public, but they were no longer functioning as a cohesive retail business. They were merely waiting rooms for their own execution. The giant had finally bled out. Now it was time to pick the bones clean. 12. In the late summer of 1986, the unthinkable became a stark, inescapable visual reality across the Northeast and Midwest. Fluorescent yellow and black banners, the universal, undeniable heralds of retail death, were draped heavily across the historic limestone facades of Gimbels department stores. The signs screamed their desperate final messages to the street traffic below. Store closing. Everything must go. The final markdown. For a brand that had once prided itself on architectural elegance, impeccable manners, and the sheer magic of the shopping experience, the liquidation process was a brutal, undignified spectacle. Betis, the parent company that had orchestrated this slow demise, did not handle the closure with reverence. They hired professional, third-party liquidators whose sole directive was to extract every last fraction of a cent from the dying empire before the leases expired. The sprawling, multi-level sales floors, once meticulously curated palaces of consumption, were rapidly transformed into chaotic scavengers' bazaars. High-end glass display cases that previously held expensive perfumes and fine jewelry were shoved together in haphazard rows, piled high with heavily discounted, mismatched inventory. Racks of clothing were ruthlessly ransacked by bargain hunters who felt absolutely no loyalty to the Gimbels name. They were driven only by the predatory instinct for a bottom-dollar price. To minimize overhead during these final weeks, corporate mandates often ordered reductions in air conditioning and lighting. The stores grew uncomfortably warm and visibly dim, casting long, depressing shadows over the picked-over merchandise. Amidst this relentless scavenging stood the remaining Gimbels employees, forced by economic necessity to preside over the funeral of their own careers. For the seasoned staff, this process was nothing short of psychological torture. These were men and women who had spent 20, 30, or even 40 years walking these exact floors. They had built genuine relationships with generations of neighborhood families. They knew the intricate, labyrinthine layouts of the million-square-foot flagships entirely by memory. Now, their final heartbreaking task was to dismantle their professional home piece by piece. They were ordered by the liquidators to sell not just the remaining merchandise, but the physical store itself. The elegant mannequins, the heavy brass clothing racks, the wooden shelving units, the display tables, and eventually even the mechanical cash registers were tagged with bright price stickers. Shoppers weren't just buying discounted sweaters, they were buying the bones of the company. What made the collapse of Gimbels so chilling was the profound lack of romance surrounding its end. Unlike a sudden, dramatic bankruptcy where a beloved company desperately fights for its life in federal court, or a scenario where a last-minute wealthy investor swoops in to save a legacy brand, the death of Gimbels was a cold, premeditated corporate execution. There was no dramatic boardroom showdown. The executives in London had simply reviewed the spreadsheets, concluded that the brand was mathematically unviable, and systematically pulled the plug. The 36 remaining stores were not a tragedy to them. They were simply a distressed asset being liquidated. Behind the scenes, the physical legacy of the Gimbel brothers was being carved up and handed directly to their fiercest rivals. It was a humiliating corporate dismemberment. Boscov's, a regional department store chain that had successfully figured out how to serve the middle-class market that Gimbels had abandoned, swept in and purchased several of the prime Pennsylvania locations. Allied Stores absorbed a large chunk of the New York and New Jersey fleet, immediately gutting the interiors and rebranding them as Stearns. And in the final, bitterest irony of all, Macy's, the eternal rival, the neighbor just one block away, the store that Gimbels had spent 3/4 of a century battling in a legendary war for retail supremacy, purchased a selection of Gimbels' most profitable suburban mall locations. Macy's didn't just win the generational war. They bought the conquered battlefield and raised their own flag over it. The climax of this sprawling corporate tragedy occurred in September 1986, at the Herald Square flagship in Manhattan. The magnificent million-square-foot structure designed by Daniel Burnham, the building that Isaac Gimbel had gambled the entire family fortune on in 1910, the undisputed birthplace of the modern Thanksgiving Day parade, was finally, completely empty. The legendary bargain basement was stripped down to the bare, dusty concrete. On the final day, there were no marching bands. There was no grand civic ceremony to honor a brand that had shaped American consumer culture for 144 years. A small group of the last remaining employees gathered quietly near the massive brass entrance doors. They looked out one last time at the echoing expanse of the main floor, a space that had once seen tens of thousands of excited shoppers a day, a space where the air used to hum with the electricity of commerce, the ringing of bells, and the scent of roasted nuts. Now, there was only the hollow silence of a massive dead building. A manager stepped forward and turned the heavy key. The brass doors clicked shut for the last time. The main breakers were thrown, plunging the cavernous first floor into total darkness. Outside, high above the street, workers were already unbolting the massive exterior signs. As the giant letters spelling Gimbels were lowered to the pavement, the neon red glow of the Macy's sign across the square reflected brightly in the darkened glass of the empty Gimbels windows. The empire that Adam Gimbel had carried in a single leather pack across the muddy trails of the frontier was officially, irreversibly gone. 13. By 1987, the Gimbels empire was officially erased from the American map. But in the ruthless, high-stakes world of commercial real estate, prime locations do not stay empty for long. The physical remains of the company were swiftly digested by a retail industry that had already moved on. The legendary million-square-foot flagship at Herald Square, the building that had once been the beating heart of the Gimbels universe, was heavily gutted. Its historic interiors, which had witnessed 3/4 of a century of bustling commerce, were stripped away. The building was transformed into the A&S Plaza, a vertical shopping center that was later rebranded as the Manhattan Mall. The grand sweeping aisles where shoppers once hunted for slinkies and holiday bargains were partitioned into a maze of smaller, generic chain stores. The physical grandeur of Daniel Burnham's architectural vision was boxed in, modernized, and ultimately forgotten. Similar fates befell the other regional flagships. The massive Philadelphia store, the site of the nation's first modern Thanksgiving Day parade, was eventually converted into a mixed-use complex of offices and retail space. The suburban branch stores, which had been the final desperate battleground for the company's survival, were quickly rebranded. Their new owners, Macy's, Boscov's, and Stearns, wasted no time tearing down the Gimbels signage and installing their own. Within a remarkably short window of time, all 36 remaining stores had their identities completely wiped clean. The physical footprint of a brand that had generated over $1 billion in annual sales vanished without a trace. Yet while the corporate entity known as Gimbel Brothers was dead and its physical stores dismantled, a strange phenomenon occurred. Gimbels refused to die in the cultural memory of the United States. It became a retail ghost that haunted the American imagination. Because the brand had been so deeply woven into the fabric of the mid-20th century, it achieved a kind of immortality through pop culture. Every holiday season, millions of families sit down to watch the 1947 classic Miracle on 34th Street. And every year, a new generation is introduced to the fierce, legendary rivalry between Macy's and Gimbels. The name is frozen in time, permanently associated with the golden age of the American Christmas. This cultural afterlife is so potent that in 2003, 17 years after the last Gimbels store had locked its doors, the brand made a spectacular return to the silver screen in the blockbuster holiday comedy, Elf. When the filmmakers needed a magical, massive New York department store for the film's central location, Macy's reportedly declined to have their brand used. The directors needed an alternative, a name that sounded authentic, historic, and instantly recognizable to an American audience. They chose Gimbels. A heavily digitally altered exterior of the old 34th Street building was used, and a fictionalized, whimsical version of the Gimbels toy department was recreated on a soundstage. For millions of younger viewers who had never actually set foot in a real Gimbels store, the brand was suddenly, vividly alive again. But for the baby boomer generation, the name evokes a much deeper, more personal nostalgia. For them, Gimbels wasn't just a movie set, it was the backdrop of their childhoods. It was the thrill of the bargain basement, the smell of roasted nuts near the entrance, and the excitement of taking the train into the city for back-to-school shopping. The memory of Gimbels is intertwined with the memory of a post-war America that felt prosperous, structured, and deeply community-oriented. Ultimately, the story of Gimbels is a profound paradox. It is the story of a company that fundamentally shaped modern consumer culture, introducing fixed pricing on the frontier, inventing the holiday parade, and defining the middle-class shopping experience, yet failed to survive the very future it helped create. The physical aisles are gone, the brass doors are locked, and the corporation has evaporated. But the echoes of what Adam Gimbel and his sons built still resonate in the way we shop, the way we celebrate, and the way we remember. 14. The neon red sign of Macy's still glows brightly over Herald Square today. A solitary victor in a retail war that lasted 3/4 of a century. But for those who remember the golden age of American commerce, that intersection will always feel slightly empty. The massive limestone building that once housed Gimbels still stands, but the soul of the place has been carefully, methodically hollowed out. The fall of Gimbel Brothers is a brutal reminder that no empire is truly too big to fail. You can invent the modern Thanksgiving Day parade. You can introduce iconic products like the Slinky. You can build million-square-foot palaces of consumption, shape consumer culture, and become a household name embedded in the very vernacular of the country. But none of that grants you immunity from the future. When Gimbels lost its connection to the shifting American landscape, when it failed to aggressively follow the middle class to the suburbs, and allowed itself to be trapped in the perilous middle ground between high-end luxury and big-box discount, it sealed its own fate. And when the founding family finally handed the keys over to a distant conglomerate, they inadvertently traded their legacy for a spot on a corporate spreadsheet. In the end, the spreadsheets dictated that the brand was mathematically unviable. But retail is more than just math. It is community. It is shared memory. When the heavy brass doors of Gimbels locked for the final time in 1986, America didn't just lose a department store. It lost a tangible piece of its 20th century identity. The legendary bargain basement, the elaborate holiday window displays, the thrilling, chaotic energy of a Saturday morning shopping trip, these are experiences that cannot be bought, sold, or liquidated. They live on only in the minds of the millions of people who once walked those aisles. Did you or your family ever shop at a Gimbels? Do you remember hunting for deals in the bargain basement, or have a story about their legendary holiday displays? Please share your memories in the comments below. We would love to read them. If you found this journey through retail history fascinating, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another documentary. Thank you for watching.